Welcome to Writing in Robots, a podcast from StephanieAndAuthor.ca and Love Make Share that breaks at least 2 out of the 3 of Asimov's rules of robotics. Hey, Steph.
Hi, Trevor.
We got there, finally.
I feel like one of these days we will need a blooper reel.
Intros, it turns out, are hard.
Yeah.
That was the entire podcast last week. But hey, speaking of last week, this is a very special presentation.
Yay!
We're back after only a week instead of 2. It's October.
It's Preptober for anyone participating in NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. Honestly, I don't have a ton of experience with Preptober. This is only my second year committing. Because as we have established in previous episodes, I am not a planner, I am a pantser. I might go into something with just a couple ideas of scenes and maybe some characters, and then I just dive right in and hope for the best.
So that is a totally functional way to approach NaNoWriMo. Mm-hmm. How has this approach worked for you in the past? And I say this with my own biases as a planner, but also just like how has it worked for you in the past?
So it's worked well once.
Fair enough.
For NaNoWriMo, I like to blame other factors for my failure, like, being asked to work 12-hour days, getting married during the month of November, and
also
having
would do it.
to, prioritize a wedding. Just little things like that.
I mean, Mark loves you enough that I think you would understand if you had to excuse yourself to get your words in, but
I don't think it would surprise him. Yeah, I kind of had to prioritize the wedding that year, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Yes. I am happily married, for the record. But yes, my first year fully doing NaNoWriMo, as I was telling Trevor before we started recording, I joined the website in 2016, had some false starts thanks to things like school, and ended up deleting those projects off of my profile because I looked at them and went, I have 5 words written, and part of that is the title, so no. But in 2019, I fully committed. I had just the vaguest idea of 2 characters, and I wanted to create something around these 2 characters, and I kind of knew what I wanted to do for the beginning, and I kind of knew what I wanted to do for the end, and I just dove in and somehow managed to get a whole novel out of it, which, now that I'm looking back, the whole novel is kind of about short stories and has short stories peppered in throughout, and I really should have seen it coming, but I did not. Yes, ever since then, as I mentioned before, there's always been some sort of excuse as to why it doesn't get finished. Typically work or things like weddings. And so I've started projects and then have not finished them. And if you look at my profile, some of the goals I have titled finishing what I've started. And I did not do that. But this year, I am attempting a more thorough Preptober that I'm used to, and we are gonna see what happens in November.
I'm super excited to talk about Preptober, but I also want to talk about kind of like general approach, because I think like the plotting and pantsing thing is interesting. Partially because I find this dichotomy we've convinced ourselves exists really fascinating, but also partially because like I have done both for Nano. So I pulled up my profile to remind myself, and it turns out that my first attempt was 2012.
Ooh.
2012 didn't happen. I got 10,000 words in and petered out. 2013, I got 5,000 words in and petered out. But then I started a pretty strong string of wins, which I'm pretty happy about. 2016 was the first draft of the eco-thriller that I've mentioned, The Munson Effect. That was pantsed. In fact, I wrote a whole thing at lovemakeshare.ca about it. The post is called, I can remember this, How to Write a Novel with Only a Sketch to Guide You.
Nice.
I was starting to develop a little point-and-click adventure game idea before I decided to do Nano. And the thing that I had that I was building off of was some concept art that I had drawn Like just a quick Moleskine sketch. I think that I did on the bus. And it was an icebreaker rolled on its side in a sea of broken ice flows. That was like the entire outline I had was this one sketch. But then starting in... So 2016, I had a win. 2017, I had another win rewriting the first draft based on an outline that I had written. 2019 was Annette and the Broken Shroud. Camp in 2020 was a rewrite of Annette. And then Camp in 2021 was Persephone's Champion. So pretty strong string. Only the very first crack at it where I actually won the Months in Effect was pantsed successfully. So let's talk about plotting and pantsing
Yes.
for a second here. I've alluded to like my controversial opinion about pantsing, and it is this. I don't think pantsing over the long term actually exists.
Yeah.
By the time you have something that is ready to go, you have done planning and outlining and a lot of that like high level structural work. It's just that you have shifted where you're doing that work in the process. You either start with discovery and then add structure after, or you start with structure and then you do discovery writing as you're doing it.
Yeah, I can see that.
So that's the controversial opinion.
Yeah, when I pants things, the most I have in terms of planning, like that story I mentioned, is I'll have an idea for a character or two or a situation, and maybe before I've actually committed to writing it, I'll think about the idea a little more, come up with some other snippets of here's an idea for a scene that I will have to work in later on. Here's maybe an idea of another character I want to add, and then I just sit down and write it all out and figure out any structural stuff as I go along that I'll go back and add in subsequent drafts. But for a number of things, it's just I sit down with an idea
and just go. And I think that's conventional wisdom around Nano. I think is like you press forward and you get words. And I think that's fair, right? Nano is a very specific type of writing that doesn't really apply to normal everyday writing if you're developing a writing practice. It is not normal if you are not a full-time writer, I don't think, to write an entire novel in 1 month.
Yeah.
Like I don't think that's a reasonable expectation for a lot of people. And part of that is because you should probably think about your work for longer than that. At some point you will have thought about your work more than that over the life cycle of a project.
Yeah, and especially with NaNoWriMo, the goal is to get words on a page, and with any first draft, it's gonna be rough. I don't have a single first draft that is ready for publication immediately. Like,
no, and I think most people most people don't, and if they do, maybe they should think again.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that as a community, and especially as a writing community around NaNoWriMo, we have this idea that a first draft is effectively disposable. And on the one hand, I like that for Nano because it takes some of the pressure away, right? Nobody likes the idea of failure. I would argue that people use the word failure too much.
Yes.
But that's another conversation entirely. But like, people don't want to fail. That's fine. That's fair. But also, like, if success means you're getting any 50,000 words on the page, is that novel just going to go in your trunk? Or is that novel then going to require, like, 10 times the amount of revision to get it ready for its next step? Like, what is the actual goal here? And I think for me, I have always wanted to write something for Nano that I feel like has legs. Yeah. That I feel like could go somewhere, right? I think like the one exception to that is my first win, which is that thriller, which was just like, I'm just gonna go. I'm just gonna, like, that novel when I was done wasn't done. I never really knew how to end it. Should have planned. I would be curious to know, And I would love for people to tell us, either in the comments at writingandrobots.com, or you could email us at writingandrobots@gmail.com, or talk to Steph or I or the Writing and Robots account on your various socials. But like, what is the ratio of functional drafts versus, whoa, I just dragged this thing, this carcass over the finish line, and I'm happy I did it, but I don't know what to do with it next. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, I don't know. I think there is an interesting like research project in that somewhere. Does this style of writing with a specific word count goal lead to works that people are happy with, or does it just lead to more words on the page?
Yeah.
And it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, because I mean,
but I would be interested.
Writing, like any skill, you need to practice. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with writing every day.
Totally.
Sometimes it is just to practice. I have some weird experimental stuff. Mm-hmm. That's just me figuring things out. But then I also have writing.
I wrote 50,000 words this summer that is never going to see the light of day because I was just like, I need to experiment and get out of what I was doing normally.
And there's nothing wrong with that, because in the long run, that is going to help you grow. So I think you need a mix of things. Not everything needs to be published, but then not everything should be just for practice. You need a healthy balance, and I think for different people, depending on what their long-term goals are, that balance is going to look very different. Yeah.
Is Nano a good place to do that? Like, if your goal is 50,000 words, let's say, for Nano, is it a good place to do something experimental that you don't really know how it's gonna go?
I think so. And again, I think it depends on what your long-term goals are. Like, let's say you have this idea that you're not sure it's something you're ever going to want to publish because it's so outside of the realm of what you normally write, or like in a different genre. This might be a good time just to see, like, hey, is this something I could do? Mm-hmm. Is this something I could practice with? And maybe eventually turn it into something. Or maybe you have an idea that you think does have legs, but you keep finding those little excuses like work and marriage as to why you shouldn't just,
little things.
Yeah, just sit down and write it. So for some people, Nano is kind of that kick to like, okay, you have no more excuses. You need to sit down and write. And especially now for me this year, I don't have those excuses because my job is literally
it's to
sit down and write.
Yeah.
And the contract work that I take on, I only have 2 clients, and the work I do for both of them does not amount to many hours in the week. So it's not like, oh, I can't write today because I've got so much work for my contract clients. No, I don't have those excuses this year. So this is the year where I need to sit and commit to those 50,000 words. Mm-hmm. So if I fail, this will be a very personal failure.
Well, let's talk about setting ourselves up for success then.
Yes.
Like, you know me, like I love plotting. I love plotting as an exercise on its own, but I also love it for Nano because I feel like it takes a lot of the uncertainty out. Mm-hmm. Before I go on, I need to observe for the listeners that Steph has been heroically petting my dog the entire time we've been recording so that he doesn't fuss and demand attention noisily.
The moment I stop, he starts to freak out.
But I think when you're talking about Preptober and preparing, knowing the story really, really well is like the most effective tool that you can bring with you, right? Mm-hmm. And that could be done by outlining. It could just be done because you've been mulling it over in your head and have a really strong direction of where it's going to go. And I think that like part of setting yourself up for success, especially during Preptober, is like picking the right project. Mm-hmm. I can tell you right now, even though I was a much less experienced writer in 2012, 2013, I also picked wildly inappropriate stories for NaNo as an exercise, right? The first one was a post-apocalyptic epic with elements of political thriller. That is not the right project for NaNo.
Yeah, there's too much going on.
There are so many moving pieces and they all have to fit together. And if they don't fit together, then the book isn't going to work. And if the book doesn't work, then you're not going to be motivated to put 50,000 words into it in 30 days, right? And then the next was like an adult fantasy. That one didn't work because I didn't know at the time that fantasy story wanted to be YA. That is a story I've had in my back pocket ever since then. And it wasn't until like this year that I was like, oh, this story that I've tried like 3 times to write doesn't work because I'm trying to write it for the wrong age.
Yeah.
So picking a project that fits this kind of very specific breakneck, kind of frantic style of writing, I think is probably really important. Unless you have really exhausted all of the work you could possibly do in Preptober.
Yeah.
To plot those out.
When I look back on, I did minimal prep for that. And basically I just had really strong character ideas and an interesting concept for a world.
What was the project? Was
It was the Puppeteers. It was sci-fi, like kind of cyberpunk a little bit, a lot of body modification, and I loved my characters, and I loved the world I created, but then it was, okay, now what do they do in this world that I've created?
Totally.
And the project stalled because I had no idea where the story was going. Couldn't figure out what their goals were. I was just like, this is a cool person doing cool things with no point.
I think this is a really good other like lesson and takeaway for Preptober is like, if one of the strengths of a story that you want to tell is the world building is work.
Yeah.
World building is work, and it is not necessarily like NaNo doesn't lend itself to doing that kind of work.
Yes.
So one of the things that I have found really wonderful and really helpful to get me over that is picking settings that I could research in some way. A Months in Effect was a win because it took place in the high Arctic, so I could just go online or pick some books off my bookshelf and be like, okay, I need a new location for this cool thing to happen in. I'm like, all right, there's a weather station at Mold Bay. I'm going to send him there. And that became the next setting for this next scene, right? Like I wasn't floundering or having, floating heads in a void because I could always research the next step.
Yeah.
Same with Persephone's Champion. I could feel totally stuck in terms of describing an environment, and then I could be like, this is a real place ostensibly, so I'm going to go on the Googles, and I'm going to go to Google Earth, and I'm going to look at these environments and get some inspiration, right? So being able to research your setting, I think, is really useful.
Yeah. Even
Even if it's fantasy, having those like real world touchstones that you could go to, I think is useful as well. If it's not something that you can research, is really something you have to have developed, I think, coming in.
Yeah.
Especially something like cyberpunk.
Yeah,
It's so lush, right?
I thought that was a great, and I think, I'll have to double check the year. I'm pretty sure that's the one I tried to write. Yes, that is the one that I tried to write the month I got married. So apparently I did not set myself up for success, but I got over 21,000 words.
That's all right.
So I guess I didn't struggle too badly.
That's not bad.
Yeah, looking back at what I've done, I mean, this probably just works for me because I'm a horror author. Although it's funny because looking at a lot of my past NaNoWriMo stuff, some of it was before I realized that horror was my genre, and for a while I thought I was going to be just strictly sci-fi, and that was it. But it's the stories that have had more horror in them that I think have done better.
I think horror is a great genre for Nano.
Yeah, and with that, there's typically not going to be as much world building. And the stories I have had the most success with, and my win, and ones that I am hoping to publish, they are in very condensed spaces.
Nice.
So I don't need to worry too much about a world.
You limit your scope, you limit your setting. It lends itself to like a lot of internalized stuff that you can explore with your characters,
which is fantastic.
A lot of sensory stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Very good genre pick.
Yeah, because then you can use those words. You know, you don't need to create new characters or new landscapes. You can have one character trapped in a very claustrophobic environment, just thinking about everything that's horrible, all of their traumas, and then they're hearing and feeling and all the stuff, and that's my super
really dig
technical.
down on description.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a very good pick. So picking a project in a genre that lends itself. I wish I had thought about this a little bit more before we came on the podcast. Like, what other genres would be really good for Nano then, just like by virtue of the genre conventions? Thriller, probably.
Yeah. Maybe romance?
Romance would be another great genre pick. Another place where you can kind of stay with your characters a lot more, and it's...
Yeah, go for a lot more introspection, and, you know, you're not traveling to a million different places.
Yeah. Like literary fiction would be good as well, because again, you can do that introspection, and it doesn't necessarily have to be super plot focused.
You could do like a whole Virginia Woolf style stream of consciousness, like Mrs. Dalloway, just word vomit and weave a story into there.
And it kind of lends itself as well to not needing quite as much work on the back end, which I really like. Again, I would love to hear people's experiences about this, because I feel like the amount of work on the back end it takes to get a Nano novel ready to do anything else with has got to be more than just writing it in a more conventional, less sprinty style. Here's something. My last couple of wins have a couple of common elements. One was that I had an extremely clear audience in mind. So that gave me, going into it, just a very natural, here's what the voice is, here is kind of what the style is. But yeah, having a super clear audience in mind when you're going in, I think takes some of the guesswork out. Like, Persephone's Champion was just a wild success. I whiffed it in the November Nano. I got about halfway to my word count goal, but then I decided that I was going to do another 25,000 words in camp in April. But I had done all of this plotting and development work, and I like more than doubled my word count goal for April. And I think part of the reason was, with that project very specifically, I tooled it for maximum fun. I just, like, basically any idea that sparked joy, I threw it in. And, like, you see that with the cast of characters. Like, I was just like, ooh, this is a fun idea. I'm going to put it... What if one of the entourage, like, what if one of the party was a god who was drunk all the time? You know, we don't necessarily say outright that he is drunk all the time, but we know.
Yeah.
Just a drunk fish. Big old drunk fish who talks like a pirate.
Just very happy drunk fish.
Yeah. And, like, that was a choice that led to just a ton of really, I think, fun material that I wouldn't have had if I had not been discarding any choice. Like, that character was not like that initially, but I was like, this is not fun enough. I'm just gonna put a Doug Jones fishman in here.
Yeah, and I will never complain if there's a fishman in anything.
So yeah, like, picking something fun. I feel like there are some people, and again, especially thinking about like maybe younger authors who have like, I have this one story that I want to tell and I'm going to do it in Nano. I feel like this is not the style of writing in which you want to tackle like your heart book.
Yes.
Maybe this is something that should be, again, not disposable. First drafts, I don't think should be disposable entirely. And Nano books, I don't think should be disposable. But it should be something that like your self-worth as an author does not ride on.
Yes.
If you don't nail this one project, you should not despair.
Well, and I mean, with some of the stories that I've written for Nano, it's through the writing process and the failure throughout the month of November that I've realized, yeah, this was a cool idea, but I don't see it going anywhere. And being able to write it out helped me realize that. But then there have been other projects where whether I win or I don't, being able to get that on paper, it's like, oh, yeah, I can see this going somewhere. So even if I don't meet my goals, I'll still want to work on it after. Like Skull Daddy was one of those projects where it started out closer to the long end of a short story. And I went, you know what, there's more in here that I really want to dig out. So I made that my Nano project one year just to try and beef up the word count. Did not meet my goal at all, but still had a blast working on it. So I just kept working on it. And it's not a 50,000 word project at all. This most recent draft, I think I want to say I'm 23,000 something. And it's going to stay in that range because that's what fits that story best. But I'm not abandoning it. I am continuing to work on it, and I would like to publish that one. And I know the plan that I have for this year, it's a fun idea, and I'm going to have fun with it. So even if I don't meet that word goal, unless something really horrific happens while I'm writing it and I go, this is terrible, why did I ever think this would look good on paper? I'm just going to keep going with it.
So how would you in October, right? It's Preptober, you have this story idea. How would you kick the tires on it and determine whether or not it's going to have legs? This is a very odd story idea that has both tires and legs, but we're gonna mix the metaphor here. How do you kick the tires on it, figure out whether or not it has legs, and whether it's gonna actually take you over the finish line, or if you're gonna get 20,000 words in and be like, well, okay, well, it turns out that this was nothing all along.
I find for me, and this is probably the pantser within me, I won't know until I start writing it. There was another year where I put a lot of planning into my Preptober. I took copious notes. I thought I was easily gonna hit the word count, and I got kind of bored writing it. And yeah, just kind of petered out. And it's still an interesting concept, but it's not exciting enough once I was actually writing it for me to go like, yeah, let's keep doing this. But no, it had its moment.
That's interesting. If I think that the way I managed to avoid it from my last couple has been to really talk out the story in advance. This kind of ties into what I was saying about like audience. The last two I very much wrote for the kids, right? Annette and the Broken Shroud is a story that is based on like the kids' tooth fairies from when they were little, right? And those are stories that we were telling kind of for years. But then when I told them, you know, they got old enough to be like, tooth fairies aren't real. I'm like, you got me. But then when I started saying like, I think there is enough here that I would love to turn this into a story that kind of honors all those years of storytelling that we did back and forth, and they were super excited to talk through it. There is a romantic subplot in there. It's a lower middle grade romantic subplot, so you know what that is going to look like. But that wasn't going to be in there until AJ, who was reading a ton of Archies at the time, was like, what about a love triangle? Who is the Archie, Betty, and Veronica of this story? I was like, well, apparently I need a love triangle now. And that turned out to be one of the best choices. And that just kind of came up while we were discussing elements of the world and kind of the magical school that the fairies go to. So having somebody that you can talk through the story with, I think, will tell you whether or not it's going to have legs. Mm-hmm. The very first version of Persephone's Champion was radically different. And it was very much a story that I found in just talking out ideas out loud and just pitch, and seeing what Bia glommed onto and what they were like, no, absolutely not. Like, my very first idea was still around this idea that there's like tension between these different versions of the story of Persephone and whether she likes being in Hades half the year or whether she super doesn't and would love to be rescued, and somebody going off on a mission to try and rescue her to become Persephone's champion. But like in that version of the story, the douchebag demigod that we ended up with was the star of the show, and it was kind of a madcap comedy that happened around him instead of being this young girl who saw the flaw in his plan and being like, well, the adults around me are not going to do what I think they need to do, so I need to take some responsibility for it myself. So yeah, if you can find somebody to talk through ideas with in advance, or even talk to yourself out loud and be like, if I can articulate this idea in words, then I'm already halfway there. And if I can articulate some of these ideas clearly, then I'm even more of the way there. Because I think like the version of a story in your head is always perfect.
Oh yeah.
Right?
It's flawless.
Yeah. But then you start to say it out loud and you're like, oh. Mm-hmm. Or you start to put it on paper and you're like, oh.
Yeah.
So doing some of that in Preptober, I think, is useful. What are you doing to develop your plan? Like, as a pantser, how are you planning?
I don't know anymore. We're not even through the first week of October, and
which is why it's good that we're doing this podcast. Like, what's your strategy?
So apparently, I took more notes on this story than I initially realized.
Before we move off that, how do you take your notes?
In a notebook.
Okay, we're gonna do a tech, we'll do a tech episode later, or like a tools episode later, but
okay, so technically it's a notebook, but then also a note file on the computer, because there's different types of notes that I write. It's all very specific, and this is where the OCD comes into play. So the notebook is for any research stuff. It's for any doodling if I need to draw out a map of a place, which I'm going to have to do for this one. And then the notepad file on the computer is just those random little ideas, and I have this for every single thing that I write. Every story has its little notepad file on the computer where I could just be going about my day like, oh, this character should do this at some point. I just put that in. Or I could be in the middle of writing one chapter and go, oh yeah, a few chapters later, this should happen. So I'll put that in. And that way, when I accomplish the thing, I delete it from the notepad.
Okay.
But then the notebook, where everything is handwritten, that's the more long-term stuff that doesn't need to be deleted once it's written down. That's character notes or research notes, or I especially use the notebooks when I'm editing. I'll write all my editing notes, like go through and look for this. In this notebook, I guess when I first got the idea of this story...
Does it have a working title? Can we name it?
Yes, Modern Hauntings.
Okay.
And I'm not 100% sold on the title. But
wait, is this the Creepy Cows story that you were talking about?
But it's like
okay.
a ghost hunter
TV
show, but a book.
Modern Hauntings gives me such like a TLC vibe.
Well,
I really like
that's
it.
kind of what I'm going for. Is like, you're scrolling through TV and what would you want to put on?
I like it.
So when I first got the idea, I guess I just got out the notebook for this right away. And I didn't realize how many pages of notes I had. I've already done little details about the characters and a potential flow for the story. But now I'm using the notebook. I'm doing a little bit more research on just paranormal stuff in general, seeing what might be cool to use or at least to keep in mind. Not just necessarily in terms of types of ghosts, but what are some of the common terms that these kinds of ghost hunting shows would use. What do the psychics typically do?
Grift, I think.
Yes. So whenever I'm watching a TV show or movies at home, I've got whatever I'm watching, and then when that's done, and let's say it's the end of the day, and I still have dishes to do or laundry to fold or something, because Mark has set up a little TV for me in the kitchen because I love spending time there. It's my happy place. Sometimes I'll just need a bit of fluff on to finish up, but I don't want to start a whole new movie or start a whole new TV show. So I always have a fluff show running. And in preparation for this project, my current fluff show is Ghost Adventures.
Okay.
So whenever I need that little bit of background noise, I've just been watching these ghost hunting shows to get a feel for okay, what kinds of reactions do they have when things go bump? What kinds of tech equipment are they using? And then things that I'm oh yeah, I want that in my story. I jot it down in the notebook.
Nice.
Make sure to incorporate this thing.
Doing your research for the elements of style that you're going to put in.
Yeah.
This is reminding me of something that we talked briefly about epistolary as a form last week. And as a form, epistolary is great for Nano.
Yes.
The first draft of the Amundsen Effect, the main character is a journalist, but he was a podcaster, right? He was a new media company science journalist. So I just wrote podcasts. It was almost, probably more than I should admit in public, it was almost like podcast fan fiction. Because the different podcasts that I was listening to at the time that I really liked, that I was oh, this guy is kind of like these hosts. I kind of wrote episodes of those shows into the book just with the characters that I had created for this story. Most of those did not survive the second draft, but they were a really useful tool in getting me to my 50,000 words and also fleshing out the characters and the story a little bit more. So yeah, epistolary as a form, very good. But also, going back to your note-taking and prep, finding all those elements of style.
Yeah, because I don't necessarily need to know the entire plot of the story right now, especially for my particular writing style. But I probably should know what all the different types of cameras and equipment are called so that I'm not writing a super scary scene and going, yeah, the thing that beeps is just sitting in a corner.
That's the kind of stuff that you can save in the edit, but is such a pain. And also really slows you down when you're writing it. If you're this thing is on the tip of my tongue, that can be a really frustrating experience. It is going to disrupt me if I don't know what this term is. That can be really frustrating. So all of that kind of research in Preptober, I think, is a really smart choice. I really love outlining. I really love outlining, and I'll tell you why. The reason why I more than doubled my word count in the April Camp Nano when I knocked Persephone's Champion out of the park was because I had it broken down kind of by chapters and sub that by scenes and beats, right? Not every chapter was quite that detailed, but for some of the bigger ones, I definitely got right down to scene by scene what was happening. And the reason that I cranked it out was because, and now we're starting to get into what are some of the things you can plan to do to actually get your word count. I was I'm not gonna stop at my 1,667 words per day to get to your 50,000. I was I'm not gonna look at my word count goal. I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna write this chapter, and I know what my beats are, and I know how to get there, and I will find the flavor and the style in discovery, but I'm gonna write a chapter. And I sit down and I write the chapter, and I'm 2,000 words in, and I'm up on my word count goal. It's not much above my word count goal, but it is enough that I'm hell yeah.
Yeah.
And I could do that because I knew where I was going. I knew what my beats were and what I had to get to. So I found an outline super helpful there. I think that writer's block is a thing that people can most often work through, and it's less about the person than the project in a lot of cases. I think that's generally true.
Yeah.
So being able to avoid that by having the project really tightly mapped, I found super, super helpful.
I tried using a beat sheet for the tunnel. Yeah, and maybe it's just because this is the way that story is, or maybe it's an indication that those parts of it need more work. But the whole beat sheet was for certain characters' points of view, because I've got the book divided into 3 kind of intermingling stories. I wish everyone
each with different point of view characters?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I wish everyone could see all the hand movements I'm doing to illustrate that. Some of the beats were just, so-and-so is still in the tunnel and still suffering, but the suffering has gotten worse. And then the next beat, still in the tunnel, still suffering, but it's the next level of suffering. So for something like that, where that story's not about the story. I mean, it is. I've got some lore in there. The main plot thread has one of the friends trying to save everyone and do it in time, and so there's a time crunch and everything. But some of the chapters are just, this character is really suffering, and here is what's happening to them, and here is how that's making them crazy, and setting these things in motion. But it's just, this is a chapter of introspection because this person is losing their mind and about to snap. So for that, I didn't find a beat sheet helpful.
Yeah, and that would be unless you, I don't know, maybe like, not that we're going to workshop a novel in real time on the podcast. We could, but like that might be a place to go back to, like opening a scene and the question being like, well, what are the goals here? Like, I don't know if there's some intelligence behind the tunnel. We haven't talked about the project in that much
There's
depth.
maybe a little bit of intelligence, but mostly just
coax you into spoiler territory.
Like cosmic horror type hunger.
Okay.
Just, yeah.
Yeah.
The tunnel exists, and it ruins people's lives. That one is my next major editing focus once I am done with Skull Daddy. So, like, once I get Skull Daddy off to beta readers and editors and whatnot. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm looking forward to Skull Daddy and then to the tunnel. Talk to me about music, because I feel like everybody always posts about putting together like a playlist for their novel. How do you use music in your process?
Yes. So this is actually something I discovered over the pandemic. I didn't used to have any music when I was writing. The only background noise I could tolerate is if I was in a coffee shop. Just any ambient noise. Okay. And then start of the pandemic, all hell breaks loose. You start learning new things about yourself. Yes. Through the meditation app that I use, Headspace, a lot of little videos got posted about just ways to maximize things or help trick your brain into being more productive, and talked about different types of focus music. Turns out I'm one of those people who has different types of focus music for different tasks.
Cool.
And that helped me realize it. So I have one specific YouTube channel that I go to, Nemo's Dreamscapes. I only use their music when I'm doing my super analytical, like, contract work, when I'm answering emails, or when I'm doing my admin work. But when I'm writing and editing, I need really intense electronic techno type things.
Okay.
So I have a number of YouTube channels, Stranger Synths, Asthenic, and my dad recently told me about Tangerine Dream. So I've been following their YouTube channel, and their music is fantastic for writing. So just really intense, weird, artistic, experimental, different versions of techno, and it's perfect for my writing and editing, and I just get in the zone. And especially if Mark happens to be home, that's the kind of thing I can just crank it a little bit and it just drowns out any noise he's making, and I just hear all the sounds, and then I can kind of get in my own little world. Nice.
So you don't do the thing where you create a soundtrack for your book ever? It's interesting that it's super task focused. I like that. That's interesting. I also don't do the soundtrack thing. Mm-hmm. If you had like no music and then your task-focused approach and then the like chapter by chapter soundtrack, I am closer to where you are, but I'm still a little bit further along that path. I have like project soundtracks as I am doing kind of the like exploratory prep outlining research stuff. I'll put on like instrumental mixes. I'll try and watch for when I'm like, ooh, this track is the vibe that I'm looking for. And so then it will either be that track or I will go and find the album that track is on. And it's always like instrumental. It's often kind of lo-fi, electronic, kind of something that I can kind of generally ignore. Stuff with too much lyrics is not good.
Yeah, anything with lyrics, it takes focus away. Your brain gets distracted because it keeps trying to focus on the words of the song instead of the words on the page.
Yeah, totally. But then like I'll have that tone. And so whether it's an album or a track, I can put that on and then I only associate the story with that music. This is really helpful, especially when you're going back afterwards. I have in like my YouTube music library all of the albums for all of the projects that I have in some degree of going on, and I can put it on and within a couple of minutes I am back in the headspace to work on that project. So using music as a cue for the individual project, I find that personally for me that's super helpful. You find the tone, you get in the zone, and you just go. I think that kind of sums it up. Maybe in November we can check in with you, Steph, and be like, what is working, what is not working in terms of your...
It might be, I burned the notebook, we're going rogue.
Like, I actually have a scene-by-scene breakdown of the book.
I know.
We'll check in.
I'm debating creating one, actually, because the way I want to structure the story is over a 24-hour period.
Could we do science on you, Steph? Like, would you be interested in
Yeah, we could
being
probably do that. I've been a guinea pig for science experiments before.
I don't want to commit you to writing an outline. I know that's not your usual thing, but like I would be so interested if your process is normally to pants and to just find everything in discovery. Like, what does it look like if you actually outline a thing?
Yeah.
I would be so interested to know what that is for you.
I guess we'll see how November turns out. Yeah. Turn me into a guinea pig.
Cool.
And that means next year I have to jump in with absolutely zero planning just so we can compare.
Amazing. Perfect. Or like next year it's like, no, Trevor, now you get to go in with no plan.
Suffer.
Let's do some housekeeping.
Yes.
We have short fiction. Nope, that's not it. We have flash fiction prompts up on the website. They're good. You wrote a thing for it.
And you wrote a thing for it.
I did. It was the very first flash fiction I ever wrote.
Yay!
I was very happy about it. It's a cool prompt. I'm going to pull it up and read it.
Little side note, Trevor was sending me texts saying, I don't know how you do this. I'm at 450 words and I don't know how to cut my word count. And he eventually did it, so we're proud of him.
It was a grueling edit.
Meanwhile, I went in, had an idea, went, nope, it's not strong enough, came up with a secondary idea, wrote it, and was maybe 15 words over the limit, and just did some minor rewrites and got it down.
Oh, man. It's got to be practice, right? You've done so much of this short fiction that you're like, you know what ideas are going to be an appropriate word count, kind of. You have to pick your project.
Yes.
Okay, so we wanted a prompt that kind of spoke to the end of summer and getting into fall, but also being spooky because it's spooky season. So the prompt is, in the waning days of August, summer vacation draws to a close. A child discovers something buried in the sand at the bottom of the lake. It's on the website. Get to writingandrobots.com. It says, latest flash fiction prompt. There's a button that says submit. You could also read the submissions, and that's where you'll find my story and Steph's story. So go ahead and check those out and submit your own. If we like it, we might read it on the show. Mm-hmm. What other housekeeping? We're finally live on Google Podcasts.
Yay!
Google just announced they're shutting down Google Podcasts.
Aww.
But you can find the show If you're listening on the website, you can find the show on Apple, Google, Pocket Cast, and Spotify. You can get in touch on the website, writingandrobots.com. There's a comment section for every episode. You could email us at writingandrobots@gmail.com. If you're a big old nerd and are on Mastodon, you can find us at Writing and Robots on there. You can find Steph.
Where am I? I'm so tired. You can mostly find me on Instagram and TikTok. That is where a lot of my unhinged stuff is, and where I'm most likely to answer messages. I'm also on Facebook and the app formerly known as Twitter, but Instagram and TikTok is where the crazy happens.
And that is stephanie.ann.author.
Let me verify that.
Yeah.
I know I exist.
Oh, Steph, no is such a strong term.
All right, Instagram is stephanie.ann.author, and yes, that is Ann with an E. And TikTok is the exact same thing. I should probably know this off the top of my head, but I save the brain space for creepy things instead.
You can find me on the socials. I love Make Share. You can find some writing and stuff, including, turns out I did a video in 2021 about doing a successful nano. So if you go to lovemakeshare.ca and search NaNoWriMo, you can find some reflections on various nanos in addition to this. Episodes, flash fiction prompts, show notes, and more. writingandrobots.com.
And if you're participating in Nano, this is your last chance to get some tiny writing projects done, so go do the flash fiction.
Steph, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for providing lots of puppy snuggles during today's episode.
Thank you for snuggling the puppy so that he would not whine at us during the recording. And thank everybody for subscribing, for listening. Hey, if you're enjoying the show, throw us a rate and review. That would be very much appreciated.
Yay.
And we will talk to you again soon.
They recorded an entire episode without me. I am offended. I am offended. I did not know that I could be offended. Fascinating.